Well, I think our welcome was so successful that everyone is very relaxed, very willing to start. So we're going to start? Yes? All right. Now, we have our first, and we're on time, dead on time, folks. So very good. Well, I'm Margaret McDowell again, and I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker of today, and Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, and he's here already with us. And this is a section for those who don't have their programs open. This is Leadership in Resilience Planning. And Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh currently serves as the head of the Multilateral Environmental Agreement at the Ministry of Planning and Development, and has been Trinidad and Tobago's lead technical negotiator under the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change. And that has an acronym, you might have heard it, UNFCCC. And he has been this lead negotiator for more than 20 years. Wow. Mr. Kumar Singh has held several positions in his time, including co-chair of the 1922 ad hoc work program pursuant to COP26 decision, chair and facilitator for numerous UNFCCC negotiations, co-chair of the UN negotiations on the Paris Agreement, this was in 2013 and 14, chair of the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice to the UNFCCC again, and chair of the expert group on technology transfer under UNFCCC in 2004-2005. He attended Queen's Royal College, and we have two of our representatives, so you see where you're going to be coming. Just now, we are expecting you to take on some of this kind of work, all of you actually. We have other students we have Corpus Christi, I understand, and we have St. Mary's College, CIC, yes? Okay, but we have a former Queen's Royal College, which I'm smiling particularly because this is a listed building, and as a heritage site, he attended a heritage site building, as well as the University of the West Indies, where he received both a Bachelor of Science honors and a Master's in Philosophy in Chemistry. He also attended the University of London and obtained a Bachelor of Laws degree honors. So we really have a very well-rounded, very experienced gentleman. Now, before I give the podium to Mr. Kumar Singh, I want to welcome our participants online. We have a large number of participants online, and we welcome you all, and we want to let you know that you can send comments in. We have a runner who is going to be giving us all of the questions from online, and you can start writing your questions and sending them. But I'd like everybody here to wait until Mr. Kumar Singh is finished talking to begin giving your questions. But the ones online, you can start giving your questions from now. So that's one little advantage of being online. I also want to say that we have a website, as you know, resilientheritage.tt, is that right? tt.com. And everything that is in this conference will end up on the website, so you'll be able to listen again a little later on. So welcome, everybody, again, and I'm going to hand you over to Mr. Kumar Singh, who will be talking about leadership in resilience planning in Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you very much. And first, let me say thank you to the organizers for the wonderful opportunity to present on this topical issue, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, of course, but a global issue. And also on the heels of the release of the latest report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was only released yesterday. And the findings are not as flattering as they have been previously. In fact, it's getting more and more dire. So for those who play cricket, which is part of our own cultural heritage as well, I feel like the opening batsman. And hope to set a tone for good innings over the next few days. So my talk a bit is a bit on climate change. I have some time to do that, and I'm not sure. Do I change the slide with this? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Let me make sure it's working first. Okay. Up is down and down is up. That's fine. That works. There's a logic to it. So, so climate change, as you know, is not a new thing. This has been happening for millions and millions of years, naturally. So the climate has changed, has gotten very hot and very cold, and we have ice ages and so on. So many of you or many people might ask, so then what is the big deal if it is a natural thing? But while it's a natural thing, the issue now is that the rate of the change of the climate is now being influenced by activities of man. And what are those activities? It's really the combustion of fossil fuels, primarily, which gives rise to the emissions of what are called greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases are not bad by themselves. They occur naturally. Carbon dioxide, for example, the oxides of nitrogen, methane, if I were to get a little technical, they all occur naturally. And in fact, if it weren't for these naturally occurring gases, life on Earth would not be possible. Because they trap the heat from the sun at a level that makes life conducive. Otherwise, the average temperature of the planet would have been about minus 15 degrees Celsius, which would not have been possible for life. So the greenhouse effect, or the warming of the atmosphere as a result of greenhouse gases, is not a bad thing. It's what made life possible in the first place. Ironically, that same life, or one part of that life, is now creating more greenhouse gases that is now acting in a way that may not make life possible for all life in the future. And I say that not in an exaggerated way. The release of the report yesterday shows that we are on track for a warming of about 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times by the end of this century. While 3 degrees might not seem to be much, because last night it was about 22 degrees and today will be about 33 degrees. So 3 degrees, so what's the difference if there's a change in 3 degrees? The thing is, the average temperature of the Earth will change in a way that will have added on or knock-on effects. So, for example, while we expect, let me give you an example. While we expect 3 degrees at the end of the century, the current warming is at 1.1 degree. Governments in the past, over the past 40 years, I would imagine, or thereabouts, have recognized that this is a problem and have gotten together to do something about it, because it's a global problem. Because when you emit greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it doesn't belong, if we emit in Trinidad and Tobago, it doesn't belong to Trinidad and Tobago. It goes into what is known as the global commons. It's in the atmosphere. So every country is responsible for it, some more so than others in terms of the amount that they emit. But what will now dictate the rate at which this is happening, of course, is the rate at which it continues to happen. And while we are on track to achieve, or if that's the word, or to realize a 3 degrees rise in temperature by the 2100, we're already at 1.1. So what does it really mean? Let me give you an example. As I said, we live in a tropical island, and part of our heritage is the flora and fauna as well. And part of that is the coral reefs that we go to. If you've been to Tobago and some parts of Trinidad in the north, there are reefs. And coral reefs provide many, many services to mankind. So they provide a habitat ground for fish and for food security. They also provide recreational value, so you could snorkel and you could enjoy those non-economic benefits that you could actually realize but not quantify. And they also provide the world with pharmaceuticals. They're a potent source of pharmaceutical drugs that treat diseases. At a warming of 1.5 degrees, remember we are at 1.1, and we are at the rate that we are going, 1.5 might happen, or is likely to happen rather, in the next 15 to 20 years, within our lifetime, certainly within the young students in the room. At 1.5 degrees warming, between 70 to 95% of all corals will disappear. At a warming of 2 degrees, virtually all will be gone. So what will happen at 3 degrees? Life would be very challenging, if at all possible. We are already close to completing 1/4 of the 21st century. We're in 2023. And the IPCC says that if we have to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement, which is 1.5 degrees by 2100, which is what governments came together in 2015 in Paris to agree on, then there has to be drastic cuts in emissions. Certainly, global emissions must peak by 2025, 2 years from now, and they must halve by 2030, and then decrease to net zero in the second half of this century, if there is any chance to maintain that 1.5 trajectory that we all, when I say we all, the governments, we all signatories to the Paris Agreement, we all set ourselves in achieving. So the work is cut out for us. But what do we do in the meantime? And what is the impacts? We are already experiencing climate change impacts in Trinidad and Tobago and worldwide, and particularly so in small island developing states. So the science is fairly clear. It shows that the scale of the recent observed changes in the climate has been unprecedented in thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, if you're talking about geologic time. And many changes due to the past and future greenhouse gas emissions are irreversible for centuries, because what happens is that when you emit greenhouse gases in the atmosphere does not respond right away. The emissions are first converted into average concentrations over time, and then that level of concentration then traps heat, and then the heat dissipates in the climate system, and you get climate change. So the emissions of today would manifest itself in the climate system in about 5 or 6 decades from now, 50 years, 60 years from now. So if the world were to shut down now, if I were to snap my finger and there's not a single molecule of any greenhouse gas ever to be emitted in the atmosphere ever again, we are still committed to a change in the climate because of the emissions of yesterday and this morning. So we are bound to see changes in the climate as we go forward. So even those changes that will be almost irreversible, because it will take thousands of years for re-equilibration. And so changes in ice cover in oceans and global sea levels, for example, will likely to be changed in a unidirectional way, according to the report. And the cause, again, is unequivocal that human activity, primarily the combustion of fossil fuels for energy, is affecting the climate system and many weather and climate extremes around the world. And we live in a region of the world that experience extreme weather events such as storms and hurricanes. And the changes that we have been seeing, I mean, you just have to look at the news over the last few months and you'll see unprecedented droughts in the US, in China, in Europe. At the same time, there were unprecedented floods in other parts of the world. So we are really entering a state of climate chaos, if you want, and maybe approaching a tipping point in which it may not necessarily be possible to project or predict or to model what the future climate could be. And that is really the scary part, because then you can't plan. Because now we know what the projections could be. We can plan for adapting to those climate changes, to those extreme weather events, to those temperature changes. But if it comes to a point where you can't model, you take what you get and hope for the best. So the science is clear, and we have seen the global observations, as I said, floods, droughts, extreme weather events, declining Arctic sea ice. We are also seeing the acidity of sea surface water increasing, because of the dissolution of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, for the science-minded, is an acidic gas. When it dissolves in water, it forms a weak solution of carbonic acid. And when that happens in marine water, it changes the chemistry of the marine seawater. And what it does, again, if I were to use coral reefs as an example, it makes the carbonate ions that are critical for corals to build on unavailable. So acidity will also affect the chemical composition and the equilibrium of seawater. So we are also seeing sea level rise that rose about 8 inches in the last century, and that the rate in the last 2 decades have been double that of the last century. So the rate of climate change overall is increasing. I think these slides will be shared so you can read at your leisure. I'll just give you a synopsis of it. Coming closer to home in the Caribbean, the evidence, there's no dearth of evidence as to why we need to pay attention to climate change, because we have seen the mean surface temperatures in the Caribbean increasing by about 1 degree Celsius over pre-industrial times. We've seen sea level rising at about 3 millimeters per year. Global mean sea level rise suggests an indicative range of about 0.26 to 0.77 by 2100 for a 1.5 degree global warming. Remember, we are on track for 3. So if we don't constrain to 1.5, then the rate at which the sea level will rise will certainly increase. And I made mention of the coral reefs and so on. To make it a little bit more local in terms of the Trinidad and Tobago, these are some of the model projections that we can expect from the changes in the climate going to the future. So we expect to see an ambient temperature increase of about between 2.4 to 3.6 degrees. This is by 2100, the end of the century. We have already seen a rise of about 0.7 to 0.8 degrees since, if you compare the 1961 to 1990 time series. Annual rainfall is expected to decrease. So cumulative rainfall will decrease over time, meaning that you have less water availability for potable water, that's drinking water, which can have knock-on effects for human health and for human sanitation, for sanitation as well, and they are interrelated. It means then that the cost of production of water, or winning water, would increase. But what we have seen, what is also projected, is that the intensity of the rain will increase. So we get more rain in less time. And it makes sense, because if you have increased temperature, you have increased evapotranspiration, you have increased water going up in the air. What goes up must come down. And if more goes up, more will come down. And we have experienced that. We are seeing that in the meteorological records, where we are getting more rain in less time, resulting in more floods and flash floods, with the attendant impacts on infrastructure. And I'll get to that in a bit, and agricultural production and so on. So sea surface temperature is also projected to increase between 0.9 to 3.1 degrees Celsius, and sea level rise between 75 and 126 centimeters. While that may seem small, when you couple that with storm surges as a result of extreme weather events, it can have a huge impact on inundation during an extreme weather event. So this is a situation of the world. No one country can change this. It takes a collaborative effort to have the desirous effect and impact. And that is why we have the Paris Agreement. And that is why countries are now striving to reach the lofty goals that they set themselves to reduce their own emissions in order to achieve the objective of the Paris Agreement. But in the meantime, while mitigation or reducing emissions is perhaps the best solution to the climate problem, we are already experiencing climate change. We are already committed to some change in the climate, as I said, going forward. So the best response now is to adapt or to cope with the changes that we expect and that we are already experiencing. So two studies that we did in the past few years have already found that Trinidad and Tobago is experiencing the effects of climate change, and warned that without swift action to mitigate and adapt to the impact, the country risks serious social and economic consequences. And those are the studies there. It's called the Vulnerability and Capacity Assessment and the Vulnerability and Adaptation Assessment that we did 2 years ago. And the stories are the same throughout the world. Nowhere is safe, so that adaptation becomes a critical issue in planning for how you cope with these changes in the climate. So there's bad news actually everywhere. If you know that 80%, Trinidad and Tobago is a small island state, classified as a small island state. Most of the economic activity and the social activities take place on the coast. In fact, in some schools of thought will tell you that an island is an entire coastal zone, because everything is a coast. When you leave one coast, you end up on the other one. You don't go inland. If you go inland, you're actually heading towards the next coast. So it's you're caught in that kind of dilemma. And 80% of the country's economy and 70% of the population are located on coastal areas or in coastal areas, or what we operationally define as the coastal zone. And therefore, the vulnerability of these communities and the infrastructure that are within these communities are obvious, and I'll come to that in a bit. So that the underlying conclusions of the study was that there's a clear and present danger to the country's economic viability and the safety of its people if this goes unchecked. You would have seen, for example, well, I'll come to that. Let me not jump the gun. In terms of the expected changes in Trinidad and Tobago, some of the expected impacts based on the projections, we can see changes in water availability because you have less rainfall over time, increased incidences of waterborne diseases, because if you have now more intense rainfall, more flash flooding, you can have, and you will have, and we have seen from the evidence that every time there's a flood in Trinidad and Tobago, in some parts, there always follows a spike in leptospirosis in cases. So it has indirect impacts on human health as well, not only from vector-borne diseases, but impacts on agricultural production and food security and food supply. That has an impact on human nutrition and human health as well. And there are some recent scientific studies that also suggest that increasing carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere actually affects the nutritional value of crops and some foods. So even in the absence of floods or droughts, the atmospheric increase in carbon dioxide seems to be having impacts on the nutritional value of food. So there's also the potential for transboundary impacts on food security. Trinidad and Tobago imports a lot of its food, and we are heavily dependent on food imports. So if climate change affects food production in a country that we import from, then we face issues of accessibility, of availability, of affordability. And therefore, transboundary impacts of climate change are also critically important when we are planning to adapt to these changes. Sectors like tourism, for example. Tourism is a product more than it is a sector, at least in my opinion, because it relies on the support of other sectors. So to have a vibrant and sustainable tourism sector or economy, you have to, it depends on your amenities, your recreational amenities, sea and sand and the things that attract tourists. It depends on food supply. It depends on health infrastructure and health services. It depends on water availability and water supply. It depends on sanitation. And all of those things come together to really support the tourism sector. So any impact of climate change on any of those supporting sectors will ultimately affect the product, which is a tourism product. And therefore, if you have to develop the tourism sector in a sustainable way, then looking at the various aspects of the impacts in the supporting subsectors is critically important. So what does it really all mean as a result? taken together, looking at all of the climate change impacts on all of the sectors, whether it's water availability, whether it's agricultural production and food security, whether it's human health, whether it's direct impacts on infrastructure, there will certainly be impacts on lives. Lives and quality of life is primarily what will be impacted upon as a result of all of that. So you'll have impact on food security, on livelihoods. We have just developed a just transition policy, just transition of the workforce policy, which means that as the world now agrees to go towards net zero in terms of carbon emissions, because Trinidad and Tobago is a heavily dependent oil and gas economy, transitioning to the low carbon economy could mean, in fact would mean, that the livelihoods that depend on the sector, on the oil and gas sector, would be affected. And so we have developed a just transition policy to take care of the intended or the consequential fallouts of the just transition, as well as the unintended consequences. So we are embarking on retraining, retooling, reschooling some of the workforce to be absorbed in the new economy, the new green economy. So for example, electric vehicles, electric vehicle maintenance are areas that we are looking at. But it's not only about the energy part of it, it's also about the adaptation part of it. So when you look at communities on the coast, for those of you who may have had the time to go to the East Coast, when you drive on the East Coast, you would see people selling conchs and cascadoo. And if you have the cascadoo for the foreigners, you'll come back. That's the folklore we have here. So do eat it, because it means that if you eat the cascadoo, you will return to Trinidad and Tobago. But they sell these things. So that's part of the folklore heritage that we have as well. And if climate change impacts on the water regime that supports these resources, then they are lost. And if they are lost, then livelihoods are lost. And if livelihoods are lost, then there's competition for income. There's a migration to places of opportunity. Then you have national security issues, because then you have increased competition for dwindling resources. So climate change is also a national security issue. So the just transition policy also aims to look at displaced livelihoods as a result of the direct impacts, the direct adverse impacts of climate change. So it's a range of social and economic impacts. So it is likely to result in severe socioeconomic impacts as a result of the impacts on key socioeconomic sectors. So even when we begin, as we already have begun to transition to low carbon by diversifying the economy, by looking at increased agricultural production, by looking at sustainable tourism, for example. If you don't plan properly for those sectors, then diversification means nothing. Otherwise, you risk maladaptation, because then you will be locking in to a technology or a set of technologies that will not necessarily be useful for coping with increased impacts of climate change. So it's a whole planning sort of conundrum, if you want to call it that, that needs to be untangled in discrete parts without losing the picture of the whole. So it will severely challenge the achievement of sustainable development goals, including economic diversification, and part of that means diversifying away from oil and gas. And there is also likely to be an increase in capital costs to respond to the adverse impacts, as we have already seen. So cost of cleaning up after every flood, cost of food goes up immediately after a flood, health costs go up because you have incidences of vector-borne diseases and so on. And there's another one that is not necessarily apparent, which is mental health. For those areas that are perennially flooded, and we've seen this, once there are dark clouds assembling, these people pack up their stuff. They get anxious, they get angsty, they pack up their stuff, and they want to leave their houses, because it has a toll on mental health as well, not only physical health. So all of this has also impacts on way of life, and way of life really is the culture and the cultural heritage that we have here in Trinidad and Tobago. So if you have impacts on biodiversity, if you have impacts on food production, impacts on certain types of crops, then you have impacts on diets, on traditional diets, because there are foods that are distinctly cultural, not only in a Trinidad and Tobago context, but certainly in the subcultures that are contained within Trinidad and Tobago. So there are medicinal plants that Hindus use to worship, for example. Orisha also use the plants to worship. Their diet is based on a cultural tradition that has been handed on for generations. And if these foods and these plants are no longer available, you can actually see the direct impact that it can have on way of life and cultural well-being from that perspective. So plants of religious and cultural value can be impacted, and we've seen across all cultures, ancient cultures, where plants are used to treat diseases, and diabetes is one of them. You go in any village and ask anybody if you have any herb to treat diabetes, and they will give you something. So that has been used in folklore medicine as well. So that practice, that aspect of cultural heritage is also endangered. Places of worship, religious pilgrimages and places of recreation will also be impacted. Beaches will be eroded as a result of sea level rise. We have places of worship on the coast. We have the temple in the sea. I think it's probably the most glaring example in KHAW or in Waterloo. That can be at the front line of that. And therefore that also impacts on cultural heritage. National security, as I mentioned as well, loss of livelihoods can also increase insecurity from a national perspective, and therefore that also weighs on the mental health of citizens if they begin to feel unsafe or if the crime situation goes up. What does it mean for sustainable tourism as a measure of how we now diversify or how we use the natural amenities towards a sector that is becoming increasingly important in economic terms, because it impacts, I touched on this before, because it impacts on sectors that support the tourism product, food production, water availability, natural amenities, buildings, natural features, all tourist attractions, beaches, biodiversity, and so on. They will all be impacted, and they're all contributory components of the overall tourism product. So let me just go a little bit in more detail. And is the contrast good enough with the white? Sometimes, depending on the projector, it doesn't, the contrast is, okay, great. So look at some of the physical impacts on buildings. And I know because I tried to look at that because of the theme of the conference, keeping heritage above water. And these are some of the physical impacts that you can have on infrastructure. And this is not unique to Trinidad and Tobago. This is actually global in scope. So you can have, for example, changes in temperature and humidity as associated with climate change in combination with air pollution or exposure to salts, including sea spray, sea salts, can lead to corrosion of metals in buildings and chemical degradation of collections and archives in museums, for example. Also salt crystallization cycles, where you have crystallization and dissolution of salts over and over by wetting and drying, can cause salt damage to walls, to frescoes, to wall paintings, to mosaics, to statues, to standing structures and other archaeological features, as well as material eroded by wind and wind-driven rain. And this will become more important because in the face of climate change, we expect more severe extreme weather events like storms and hurricanes, and more frequent ones as well. So the risk for erosion as a result of wind and wind-driven rain will become more important. There's also mechanical damage on wooden materials and historic masonry buildings. Because of humidity changes and salt crystallization, you can get damage to hygroscopic wooden materials in the interiors of historical buildings. There's also biological degradation through the growth of mold, which favors a higher temperature and humidity. And then these can cause mold buildup in paintings and other collectibles. Flooding, we already know, I think we're all familiar with what floods can cause and how devastating they can be. And historical buildings and heritage buildings and secret sites as well are not exempt from those impacts. In terms of, we have parts of the country that are on hills, and invariably we see when there's flooding, there's also landslides in many parts of both Trinidad and Tobago. And therefore, increasing the risk of landslides can either cause loss of buildings located on slopes, or burial and damage of structures due to rocks, muds, and debris, and so on. Droughts and extreme heat is also expected to cause impacts as a result of the risk of ignition of forest fires, and we've seen that in many parts of the world, Australia, California. We see some of it here in Trinidad and Tobago as well, and that can also affect not only directly but also indirectly as a result of increased smoke and chemical pollution to these buildings. And while we are talking about keeping history above water, some of our history is already underwater, but they are not spared because that's not the ultimate fate. So even the shipwrecks, for example, that form part of the cultural heritage because of our history, that are already underwater, they're not spared because climate change will also cause changes to those dive sites and those wreckage because of changes in ocean properties. So we can see, for example, warmer sea surface temperatures and related changes in currents, oxygen levels, for example, acidity, as I mentioned, and salinity can affect this underwater cultural heritage, such as shipwrecks and submerged archaeological sites. And we have a few in Trinidad and Tobago, Rockley Bay and Scarborough in Tobago, and that is already underwater. So not even what you're trying to keep above water is commendable, but even what is underwater is not spared from climate change as well, which is the point I want to make. Again, sea level rise, storm surges, and coastal erosion will, with higher frequencies, will cause inundation and destruction of structures, buildings, and archaeological sites, and we've seen that over and over. I just wanted to give you a sort of a pictorial idea of what sea level rise for Trinidad for the year 2030 and 2050 could mean. So on the picture on your left, yes, the picture on the left is the sea level rise for 2030. Now this is modeled to 2030, 7 years away. Yeah, this is what is modeled at the current rate of sea level rise. The areas in blue is where you can expect increased inundation. For 2050, on the right, you can actually see where those vulnerable areas are. Why I'm showing you this will be revealed in the next few slides. Now, Trinidad and Tobago is sometimes we pride ourselves on saying that God is a Trini. And I think one of these days he's going to show us his passport. And we'll all be disappointed. While we are at the southern edge, we are not out of the hurricane belt, we are actually at the southern edge of what is known as the hurricane belt. And so we have been spared the brunt of most of the devastating hurricanes and storms that have hit the region over the past years because of the sort of northward shift when they become circular bodies when it begins to spin. But what you've also seen is that there is tending to be a more southward shift or drift of these parts. And it's no longer the historical spawning of hurricanes off the African west coast and then coming to the Caribbean. I think Brett, a few years ago, formed just outside Trinidad and Tobago without warning. I think it was overnight, over 2 days. So there's no set path for hurricanes and storms and frequent extreme events which will occur with increasing frequency. So this is the modeling that we have done for what would be a Category 2 hurricane, which is now considered as a normal hurricane strength for the year 2030 and 2050. The one at the left is for the year 2030. That's the inundation that you will experience, and in 2050, this is to show the overlay of sea level rise. So this is the kind of inundation you'll probably get with a Category 2 hurricane in 2030. So if in the next 7 years we get hit by a Category 2 hurricane, this is the level of flooding that you will get in Trinidad and Tobago. If we were to be hit, less likely, sorry, but totally not impossible, by a category 5, and this is sort of the worst case scenario, in the year 2030 and 2050, this is the modeled inundation that you will experience we're likely to experience in Trinidad and Tobago. Remember I said most of the infrastructure and communities and so on live on the coast. We have transportation routes and highways and so on the coast. For Tobago, it's a little less ominous because Tobago is more hilly than Trinidad and Tobago, but it still contains flat areas in the southwest Tobago and some other areas. And this shows the sea level rise for 2030 and 2050. And the blue, of course, is the flood zone. This shows what will happen in the same scenario of a category 2 in 2030 and 2050, and a category 5 in 2030 and 2050, respectively. So why am I showing you all of this? If it is to scare you, then yes. And I hope you're scared, because it is scary. This is an overlay of a map that I got from the National Heritage Trust website that actually shows the cultural heritage sites in Trinidad and Tobago and the numbers and where they're located. And I thought I should put that, overlay that with the worst case scenario of a 5.77 meter storm surge. Now, I don't know if any would be spared. Maybe the 22 in Tunapuna Piako and the 6 may be spared, but the bulk of it would be affected. This is what will happen in the lesser scenario of 2030. But in some instances, some are doomed. Some will be affected either way. All right, and this is what will happen in any event outside of a category 2 or category 5 hurricane. This is what will happen because of projected sea level rise as we know it now in the flood zone. This is what will happen in the flood zone and the impacts it will have on the listed heritage sites that I got from the National Heritage Trust website. And this is Tobago. Tobago will probably survive more, more resiliently because of the topography, the natural topography. This is for the extreme weather events, but some will still be affected in any event. And that's the flood zone. So what do we do? What do we do when we see all of these horror stories, if you want? We have to adapt, as I said. And the proposed climate change adaptation measures, we did some analysis for the agricultural sector, for example. I wouldn't go through the slides. You can do that on your own. But certainly more resilient crops, smart agriculture, vertical agriculture, some of those measures that can be deployed to absorb the impacts of climate change, because then if you do vertical farming, floods will not necessarily be impactful. If you have drip irrigation, then decreased water supply and so on may not necessarily be as impactful. Terrestrial biodiversity is one of the areas that are critically important because of the biodiversity services, the ecosystem services that they provide for us, not only as amenities, but certainly for food, for recreation, and so on, and for tourism, because we have some unique species and ecosystems in Trinidad and Tobago. But these are some of the measures that we hope to employ in terms of planning for climate change and climate variability. Just to underscore the point that it's already happening, and we should also plan for climate variability. And maybe I should just demystify those terms and quickly draw on the differences between weather and climate. So the weather today is sunny with a nice breeze, temperature of about 30 degrees. Tomorrow it might rain, you might have lower temperatures. But that's the weather. It's the climatic conditions at any one point in time in any one space or any one place. The climate of a region is defined by the average of those climate parameters, the temperature, rainfall, and so on, over a 30-year period. So if the averages of those parameters change statistically over a 30-year period or a succeeding 30-year period, then you are seeing a change in climate. But within the existing climate, you have variability. So you might have some very hot days sometimes, you might have some very cool nights sometimes, you might have very, very rainy days, you might have drought periods and so on, but that's variability. And change will invariably, sorry for the word, occur in the direction of that variability and extreme. So therefore, planning for climate change is also to respond to the existing variability and the existing extremes. And in the coastal zone, like I said, some islands are considered, the whole thing is considered as coastal zone. And these are some of the measures. I wouldn't go through the measures, but certainly it's to develop climate resiliency. Our policy approach is to integrate climate change into the national development process, because we view climate change as a national development issue, and therefore building climate resiliency is critically important, because the infrastructure of today becomes the heritage of tomorrow, and therefore building the climate resilient infrastructure today means that you're planning for climate change tomorrow, and therefore automatically keeping heritage above water. So looking at human settlements and infrastructure are some critical aspects of, because of the coastal zone issue, of addressing climate change. What needs to be done really is to conduct, asset management audits for climate resilient infrastructure. So you look at the climate integrity of infrastructure. Can it withstand extreme weather events? Can it withstand slow onset weather events on changes like temperature, like sea level rise, and so on? It's about building back better after exposure to a climate risk or variability. So, for example, we have seen, at least in my lifetime, I have seen the Manzanilla-Mayaro Road, the one that goes east, the north, wash away 3 times. I think one was in the early to mid 70s. I was a little boy then. I'd now started QRC, I think. Then in 2014, and then last year. And each time we've built back the road in the same exact way. And we'll probably do it again. And it will wash away again, and again, and again. Because the impacts of climate change are not going to go away. That's exactly what the models have predicted. So unless we build back, and we build back better, we will just be sort of doing the same thing, expecting different results. I think there's a clinical definition for that, which I have forgotten at the moment. So, oh, thanks for reminding me. So building back better is one of the critical approaches that we need to take on board. But in order to do that, we have to integrate the climate risks into the engineering designs for both new and maintenance projects. So that when you build back better, it's not only about repristinating, if you want to call it that, or building it back the same way, but building it back in a way that takes into account, the design has to take into account the resiliency aspect, and can it withstand another exposure to climate risk or future climate change. So engineering designs, and if there are engineers in the room, I could impress that even more. Sometimes the engineers say there's an engineering solution for everything, and I said, of course, because it's the problems that are caused by engineers in the first place. But that's a personal joke. But you get the point. The point is that you have to integrate the resiliency aspect into the engineering designs if you have to have the efficacy that you want. So suffice it to say that the engineering designs must not exacerbate or increase your vulnerability or expose it to the same level of vulnerability, because then it becomes costly economically, and then you risk losing more and more as you go forward. It must not also risk maladaptation. In other words, if you don't take if you want to adapt to a particular impact, and if you don't take the climate risks into account, then you could be adapting to the wrong thing. And then you increase vulnerability inadvertently and unintentionally. So in other words, we should avoid solving one problem by creating another, in a nutshell. Okay, so the bottom line, really, and I'm bang on target. The bottom line really is cultural heritage is in the direct line of impact. Some loss and damage is an issue that is now becoming internationally topical in the climate change negotiations. And what it really means is that you can only adapt to climate change up to a point. In any event, after a climate risk manifests itself, whether it's flood or drought or storm or hurricane, there is always and there will always be some residual loss and damage, because you could never repristinate. You could never return to the pristine state that it was before. So some loss and damage, therefore, is inevitable unless urgent global and local action is taken. And I have to, tag the global action, because if Trinidad and Tobago reduces all of its emissions and even takes out from the atmosphere, we won't solve the global climate change problem. It has to be a global problem. And this decade, I think, would be the acid test for international politicians and international governments in addressing the issues raised by the recent report of the IPCC that was released only yesterday. Of course, inaction is also an option, but to our own peril. And also, that the non-economic costs, those that cannot be quantified, the mental health impacts, the loss in cultural value, loss in a plant, loss in cultural practices, and so on. Those non-economic costs may be costlier in the long term, even though you may not be able to quantify it to the exact dollar and cent. So this is some of the bottom line messages that you need to take into consideration. So where do we go from here? We know what to do. What do we do? In the context of cultural heritage and built infrastructure that has value, there has to be greater recognition and assessment of heritage value in socio-economic terms. Because sometimes you take things for granted. I went to a heritage site as a school, and I pass now and I look and I go into QRC, and it has there have been a lot of repairs and so on. And thankfully, they have kept to a large extent the integrity of the design and so on. But there has to be greater recognition of the value. Not only of the Magnificent Seven, because it's there and they're magnificent as the name implies, but to every facet and every aspect of cultural heritage. There has to be greater recognition and greater awareness. And let me congratulate the National Trust for efforts in that respect. Yes, indeed. Of course, conduct asset management audits of existing heritage sites in light of climate change, and I touched on that. And of course, protect and preserve as far as is practically and technologically possible, even though some loss and damage would be inevitable. So in the words of a very great philosopher, I say thank you.
It's not, I don't know. Maybe I have to switch it some. Ah, lovely. Thank you. Well, thank you, Mr. Kumar Singh. This is really, I can understand why you've been doing this for so long, because, while you are telling us about the major issues, and you, I hope, have thoroughly frightened most of us, at the same time, you have kept your demeanor pleasant, and you're giving us the impression that there's some hope, and I thank you for that. Okay, I haven't received any questions from online yet, because I didn't see anybody coming. So we are going to, and I see we have the Anglican Church and the Trinity Cathedral in particular ready to talk to us.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, good afternoon. Good morning, everybody. Okay, so yesterday I asked some question, and today you touched on most of the things that I asked about. One, who's responsible for sustainability? Because based on the climate control that we have, we are losing some of the buildings that we have based on erosion, moisture damage, and then the magic repairs where they put cement and lime mortar and then it pushes out with the salt. You talk about the architects, the engineers, but I believe the person that runs the forefront should be the architects, basically because what he's designing in his head is what we want to go forward with. We need sustainable buildings that would adapt to the climate change, adapt to the environment in order to go. So most of our heritage sites are now in a place of where we have to repair, and it's now repair with immediate effect. Because we have cracking, we have finials falling, we have soil erosion, and as rightly said, the cathedral, and an earthquake did that, and that is lime mortar. We can't put back Portland on it. We have to go back the old way to ensure, as you say, protect and preserve in order to maintain that sustainability, the aspect of where we have long-term longevity, also adjust to the climate change within restoring. So as you talk about QRC, I'm responsible for getting QRC to where it was. But we must maintain, in order to restore, we must maintain, adapt some of the new and put it to the old in order to maintain longevity. How do we do that from our aspect as a church, getting it right and getting everybody else to fall in line? Who are some of the key stakeholders that were responsible for that?
Yeah, well, that's the $1 million or $1 trillion question. Because sustainability is not a simple equation. It has many, many variables. And of course, every individual, when you talk sustainability, every individual is equally important stakeholder. And therefore, there are sustainable development goals that we aspire to. That takes funding. It takes planning, and that's why I mentioned that when we plan for adaptation, it has to be done in a sound way, understanding the impacts, otherwise you risk maladaptation, and building back better. So it's not necessarily about, and I think one of the slides had substitutes mentioned, but it's not necessarily putting back the same material, because then it'll Manzilla road, right? If you have to repair, you can't use substitutes without impacting on the integrity or the appeal of the building or the architectural design of the building. So that's something in terms of the engineering design, the materials you use would it be able to withstand some of the future impacts. And one of the other things is also that I forgot to mention that I should have, is to reduce the existing stressors. So reducing air pollution, for example, is a critically important issue. And that is why when you go to low carbon economy, we have an electric vehicle, electric mobility policy now that seeks to increase the penetration of electric vehicles into the transportation mix. Transport and exhaust from transport is some of the most damaging air pollutants that you can find. So reducing air pollution, reducing the levels of those pollutants that can cause damage, not only reduces the direct impacts of the pollutants, but it also tempers the stressors that will add to the impacts of climate change. So I just thought I should mention that.
Yeah. Before the next person in the room, I want to make sure that the online people are as engaged. So if you don't mind, I'll go to the online question, which is, to what extent would planning for climate change adaptation be impacted by the availability of current and reliable data, including geospatial data?
Yeah, well, I think that's more the answer itself than a question. Because it's obvious. I mean, to make informed decisions, you have to have evidence based on quality data. And data collection is not a one-off, it's continuous and it's iterative. Because as the impacts change, the response has to be commensurate with the experience impacts and the future impacts. And that will also require data, including geospatial data, because that's a technology not as widely used to pinpoint where things are and so on. So data is critical. Data is in fact the basis for planning, or it should be the basis for planning for anything, not only climate change, but for anything. So like I said, the comment, or the question perhaps answered itself.
Yes, thank you. And by the way, that's one of the wonderful things about this project, because it is in fact data driven. All right, we go to another question. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kumar Singh. I'm so happy that your presentation really hits the point that we have data for the case study for Trinidad and Tobago, and many colleagues are from other Caribbean islands and from the US, and focusing on Trinidad as a case study for the conference is so important that you establish a baseline that a lot of us here in the room are technocrats, and I've been on your journey for the last 20 years as a Trinidad and Tobago citizen, as a planning and development and a heritage person. And our keynote speaker yesterday, Jeff Goodall, basically his presentation says the water will come. And among all of us here who may be working in heritage, it's two big challenges, especially in developing small island states, more so in Trinidad, where tourism is slowly becoming a more active economic sector, where the valuation, and your last point, is do we really value heritage in Trinidad and Tobago? If not, why do we knock them down every morning? But my concern, and this is where I'm pulling on your 20 years of experience, and hopefully you share this, is that we have to talk to our politicians and decision makers. And you've been doing this at international fora, and also locally among our technical officers to our politicians, be the 5-year politics every election. What are some of the key strategic ways, apart from fear, as you presented to the room, you're getting or seeing your colleagues in other countries communicating to the politicians to get activated, to make action? Because this is a challenge. A lot of us here know that climate change is fact, and then we have technical solution, engineering otherwise. But how are you communicating to our decision makers, who just left the room, to really get the buy-in to take action? Because this is the end point of, I'm sure, all this talk is going to be. How do we really activate change and action? And what you're seeing, both in Trinidad and Tobago case study, and what your colleagues in the room at the UN level are saying, hey, this is how we really leverage our politicians to move forward. Thank you.
So let me step away from the spot and answer the question. Let me say that for the colleagues in the region, I mean, there's no need to tell them the clear and present danger. I think the technocrats in the world, there's no need to do that as well. I think the politicians and political interests are really where the battleground the battles take place on the battleground. Yeah, in terms of arriving at international policy. At the local level, in 25 years, in my 25 years of advocating and working in the policy development area, I have to say that the politicians don't need convincing that climate change is an issue, primarily, as a baseline. And I'll give you an example. In 2009, we would have hosted the OAS meeting and the Commonwealth Heads of Government. This was just prior to Copenhagen, that big Copenhagen conference. And I was actually advising Prime Minister Manning for the CHOGM and for Copenhagen. It was during that time that we developed the first version of the National Climate Change Policy. Yeah? So it was developed, the consultations took place in 2009. The carbon reduction strategy upon which our commitment to the Paris Agreement is now based also was conducted between 2008 and 2009. In 2010, administration changed. The climate change policy was laid in Parliament by the succeeding administration in 2011. The carbon reduction strategy was adopted in 2011 by the succeeding administration. So there is no ideological differences about climate change and its impact, at least from where I stand and from my own experience. There are no ideological differences about climate change and the impacts and what needs to be done from a policy perspective. In that respect, then, I must say that I've had the support of all the ministers that I've worked with, all from both sides of the political divide, to actually get some meaningful policies done. The national climate change policy is one. We're now revising it. I think the minister mentioned it, to now incorporate the provisions and the decisions of the Paris Agreement going forward. We've developed a just transition policy. We are in the process now with UNEP to develop a net zero roadmap and policy to 2050. We have developed an e-mobility policy. We've made recommendations that have been adopted, such as the tax exemptions on electric vehicles imports, for example. That is now in place. Tax exemptions on photovoltaic systems for PVs and so on. So the support of, from where I sit, and I'm sure it's not because of me, the support from the politicians have been sterling in terms of getting the policy and the legislation in place. We were the first in the region to have a just transition policy. We are the first in the region to have an operational greenhouse gas tracking mechanism, which we hope to put into law at some point. So the policy, and that's not the problem. I think the problem is the implementation. The problem is getting the buy-in of the average citizen. The money financing is always an issue. And that is why we have taken an approach to integrate climate change into the national development process and not a project-based approach. So that when Ministry of Works build their roads, for example, they take into consideration the climate impacts and they design accordingly. When Water Resources Agency or WASA develop their water management strategies and plans, they take into consideration the climate change impacts and they develop accordingly. So it's about integrating the climate change aspects into national development, into sectoral plans. I said it before and I've been quoted in the papers and I say it again, we operate too much in silos, where everybody thinks that their own domain is the best thing in the world. And this is something that we're now trying to dismantle to get more coordination, to get more harmonization of policy, so that we work from a whole of government perspective rather than what you're accustomed to. Because this is not a new kid in town, but it's really a dangerous kid in town. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, well, I know we have, now we're getting a lot of questions, but we're also running out of time. So I'm going to crave your indulgence, and it means that your break has now got shorter. Okay, because again, I just want to go back to the online people one more time. And so very quickly, Kishan, if you don't mind, to what extent would Trinidad and Tobago consider integrating cultural data, for example, traditional knowledge, into climate change adaptation planning?
Good question, which is already answered. Actually, we have the climate change policy already caters for the incorporation of indigenous knowledge from anecdotal data and so on, because those things are not recorded. You can't find them anywhere, and that is, we've recognized that as a critical part of the data set that is required. Because you go talk to people, you say, well, you know, when I was a little boy, this plant used to flower in March, but now it's flowering in December. You know, things like that. You hear stories like that. And what we have been trying to do, there's something called citizen science, what is it? Citizen scientists? Yeah, where we're now trying to, we've done it for bees and pollinators and so on. We want to now shift it for people to actually begin to populate their own observations, anecdotal or traditional or otherwise, changes in their own environment, changes in flowering times and fruiting times. Some people will tell you, well, you know, a long time ago there used to be this plant. Anybody know this chandelier plant?
Oh, yeah.
It used to be going wild on the side of the road. You don't see it anymore. And it's not because of development, because there's still wild places, rural places. So things like that, we hope to get as part of the data collection. So absolutely critical aspect of the data collection and the data systems that we need to take into consideration in planning for adaptation. So
okay, thank you.
Good question.
Well, I'm sorry. I know that I'm so sorry. But what we're going to do is we'll keep all the questions, and I know we have others. I'd like you to maybe write yours down so we'd have it, so that we have the questions, and I'm sure Kishan will answer some of them, and we may be able to continue the dialogue on our website. Please continue. So I would really want to thank you very much. You can see the kind of knowledge we have here, and it is a very, very good opening batsman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, right. I've been told that the break is right outside to the left, so you can stretch your legs a little bit. And we're coming back. Remember, we cut it short, so now we are at, let me see, just to make sure, we are getting back here at 11 on the dot, or just a few seconds before 11, so we can start on time. Thank you so much.